They sold everything I was promised and smiled at my funeral like they had already won. I want you to stop whatever you are doing right now because what I am about to tell you is not just a story. It is the story of how the two people who were supposed to love me more than anyone on this earth, my own parents, looked me in the eye for 23 years, called me their child, sat beside me at dinner tables, watched me cry at graduations, held my hand at funerals. And the entire time, they were quietly, methodically, lovingly dismantling everything that was supposed to be mine. And the worst part? The absolute worst part that still keeps me awake at 3 in the morning with my chest tight and my hands shaking? They did it with smiles. They did it with hugs. They did it while telling me they were proud of me. So if you have ever felt invisible inside your own family, if you have ever looked around at a dinner table and wondered why everyone else seemed to belong to a different version of your home than you did, if you have ever swallowed something painful because you loved someone too much to name what they were doing to you, then sit down. Because this one is going to take a while, and I need you to hear every single word. My name is not important right now, but the story is. I grew up in a house that looked, from the outside, like the kind of family other people envied. My father was a man of few words but enormous presence. The kind of man who walked into a room and made the air feel different. He built a small construction business from nothing, from genuinely nothing, starting with a single truck and a loan from his older brother that took him 6 years to pay back. By the time I was in middle school, that business had grown into something real. We were not wealthy in the private jet sense, but we were comfortable in the way that matters. The house was paid for, the cars were reliable, the refrigerator was always full, and every summer my father would take us somewhere, a road trip or a cousin's wedding in another state, and he would pay for everything without ever mentioning money. He had a pride about that. A quiet, unspoken pride that I respected as a child and eventually came to understand, much more complicated as an adult. My mother was the kind of woman who made everything look effortless. She cooked from scratch, kept the house spotless, knew every neighbor by name, went to church every Sunday, and volunteered for 3 committees she had no time for and still somehow had dinner on the table at 6:30 every single evening. People loved my mother. I loved my mother. That is the sentence I keep coming back to, over and over, because it is the one that makes everything else so impossibly painful. I loved her. I genuinely, deeply, completely loved her, and she knew that. And she used it. I am the middle child. I want you to understand what that means in a specific kind of family, in a specific kind of culture, because it is not just a birth order statistic. I have an older brother named Marcus and a younger sister named Diane. And from the very beginning, from the very earliest memories I can excavate from childhood, there was a hierarchy in our house that nobody ever named, but everybody operated inside of. Marcus was the firstborn son. In my father's world, that meant something almost sacred. Marcus was the one my father took to job sites on weekends. Marcus was the one my father taught to drive at 15 in an empty parking lot, laughing and patient in a way I had never seen him be with me. Marcus was the one my father called when something needed to be decided, even when Marcus was 19 and had no idea what he was talking about. And Diane was the baby. Diane was the one my mother wrapped in a particular kind of softness that she never quite extended to me. Diane was the one who could cry and have the whole room reorganize itself around her feelings. Diane was the one whose school plays my mother attended in the front row with a video camera, whose college applications my mother sat up until midnight helping with, whose boyfriend was invited to Christmas dinner the very first year they dated. I watched all of this from the middle, from that particular kind of invisible space that middle children know, close enough to see everything clearly, far enough away that nobody was watching you see it. And for a long time, a very long time, I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself families just work this way. I told myself I was being sensitive, dramatic, ungrateful, the terrible things you tell yourself when the truth is too heavy to carry. But here is what I need you to understand before I go any further, because it is the key to everything that came later. My grandfather, my father's father, a man named Robert, who died when I was 12, he left behind a piece of land. Not a huge piece of land, but significant. About 40 acres of farmland out in the county, land that had been in the family for 3 generations, land that my grandfather had worked with his own hands as a young man, land that my father grew up running through and that my grandmother tended a garden on until she passed. When my grandfather died, he left a will. I know this because I was at the reading of that will. I was 12 years old, and I sat in a lawyer's office in a wooden chair that was too big for me, wearing a scratchy blazer my mother had made me put on, and I heard the lawyer read the words. The land was to be divided equally among my grandfather's 3 children, my father, my Aunt Carol, and my Uncle Pete. And then the lawyer said something else, something I almost missed because I was thinking about whether I could take the blazer off. He said that in the event my father chose to sell or transfer his portion, it was the explicit wish of Robert Sr. that the proceeds be held in trust for all 3 of his grandchildren. Marcus, me, and Diane, in equal shares. Equal, that word. I heard it. I was 12 years old and I heard it and I filed it away somewhere in the back of my mind. The way children file away important things they don't fully understand yet, carefully, quietly, in a place they can find again. I could not have known then that 23 years later, that word would be the thing that changed everything. I could not have known that someday I would need to remember exactly what that lawyer said in that office, in that wooden chair, in that scratchy blazer. But I remembered. I always remembered. And that is the detail that matters. So let me tell you about the years in between, because they matter too. They matter because the betrayal I am about to describe did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, in layers, the way a house develops rot, from the inside, invisibly, until one day you step on the floor and your foot goes through. I graduated high school with a full academic scholarship to a state university 4 hours away. My father shook my hand at graduation. Not a hug, a handshake. My mother took a photo. Marcus, when he had graduated 2 years earlier with a C average and no scholarship, had gotten a party. 60 people in the backyard, a catered spread, my father making a speech with a glass of wine in his hand and actual tears in his eyes. I told myself it was because Marcus was the first to graduate. I told myself it did not mean what it looked like. I went to college on that scholarship, and I worked part-time at the campus library to cover my living expenses. Because when I had asked my father if he could help with housing costs, he had looked at me with an expression I can only describe as surprised, as if the question itself was unexpected, as if it had not occurred to him that I would need anything. He gave me $300. Marcus, I later found out, had been given a monthly allowance throughout his entire 2 years of community college. Diane, later still, was given a used car for her first day of college, and my parents co-signed an apartment lease so she could live off campus. I am not telling you these things to make you feel sorry for me. I am telling you these things so that when the big revelation comes, you understand that it did not come from nowhere. It came from a pattern, a long, quiet, consistent pattern that I had been documenting in my own heart for years without ever using that word for it. I graduated college in 4 years, debt-free because of my scholarship, with a degree in accounting and a job offer already in hand. I moved to a city 3 hours from home, found a small apartment, started building a life. And for a while I kept trying. I kept calling. I kept driving home for holidays, sitting at that dinner table, watching my mother fuss over Diane's new haircut and my father talk to Marcus about the business. Because Marcus had joined the business by then, right out of community college, given a management title and a company truck and a salary I only found out about years later, and I kept eating my food and asking polite questions and telling myself that this was just family, that all families have their dynamics, that I was fine. I started dating a woman named Priya who I eventually married, and my parents were polite to her in the way that is worse than rude, the way that makes someone feel like a guest who has overstayed without anyone having the courage to say so. Priya noticed things I had spent years teaching myself not to see. She noticed the way my mother would ask about Marcus's kids in elaborate detail and then ask about ours with the same energy she used to ask about the weather. She noticed the way my father would turn conversations about my career into bridges back to whatever Marcus was doing at the company. She noticed. And at night in our apartment, she would look at me with this careful, loving expression, and she would say, very gently, "Something is off with your family." And I would say, "I know, but they're still my family." And she would nod and not push it because she understood that some truths have to be arrived at on your own schedule. The phone call that started everything came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I remember because I had just come back from lunch. I was sitting at my desk, with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and my phone rang with my mother's name on the screen. My mother almost never called me in the middle of the day. My heart did something complicated before I even answered. She was cheerful. That is the first thing I noticed. She was almost artificially cheerful, the kind of bright, fast-talking energy she used when she was nervous or guilty, a tell I had learned to read over decades. She said she was just calling to catch up. She asked about Priya. She asked about work. She mentioned that the weather had been beautiful. And then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "Oh, and your father and I made some decisions about the property. We just wanted you to know." I felt something go cold inside me that had nothing to do with my coffee. "What property?" I said, even though I already knew. I already knew. "Grandpa Robert's land," she said, still cheerful, still breezy, as if she were telling me about a new recipe. "We sold it finally. It was just sitting there and the upkeep was getting to be too much. And your father found a really good buyer, a developer, and it was a very fair price." She kept talking. I stopped hearing the individual words. I was back in that wooden chair in that lawyer's office. I was 12 years old and I was hearing the word equal. I waited for her to tell me the rest. I waited for her to say, "And of course, we set aside your share." She never said it. She talked for 4 more minutes about the developer and the price and how relieved they felt, and then she said she had to start dinner and she would talk to me soon. And she hung up. And I sat at my desk for a very long time, not moving, while my coffee went completely cold. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision matters. I did not call back immediately. I did not fire off an angry text. I did not call Priya and unload everything in one breathless rush. Though every instinct I had was screaming at me to do all of those things. I sat with it. I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened before I did anything, because I had learned slowly, painfully, over many years of being dismissed and talked over, and made to feel like my feelings were the problem. That when you are dealing with people who are very good at reframing reality, you need to be sure of your ground before you step onto it. So I sat, I thought, and then I started making calls, not to my family, but to other people. The first call I made was to my Aunt Carol, my grandfather's daughter, my father's sister, a woman who had sat in that same lawyer's office and heard the same will read aloud. I had not spoken to Aunt Carol in almost a year, but she picked up on the second ring, and when I told her what my mother had said, there was a silence on the line that told me everything I needed to know about how informed she had been about this decision. Then I made a second call. I called my grandfather's old lawyer's office. The man himself had retired, but his firm was still active, and I explained who I was, and I asked if they still had records from a probate matter going back over 2 decades. The receptionist said she would have to check and call me back. She called me back the next morning. They had the records. They still had everything. And suddenly I understood that the most important thing I had ever stored in my memory, a word spoken in a wooden chair in a scratchy blazer, was about to become the most important piece of paper I had ever held in my hands. Because here is what my parents did not know. Here is the thing that they, in their confidence, in their long habit of treating me as the child who would not notice, who would not ask, who would simply absorb whatever was decided and move on, they did not know that I had become an accountant. They did not know that I spent my professional life reading the fine print in documents that other people signed without looking. They did not know that when I drove home that weekend, alone, without telling anyone I was coming, and sat down with my grandfather's original will and the deed transfer documents and a 37-page settlement agreement that my father had signed with the developer, they did not know that I would read every single line. They did not know that the trust provision my grandfather had written into his will had never been legally dissolved. They did not know that my father, in his eagerness to complete the sale and distribute the money the way he had privately decided to distribute it, to Marcus, who was keeping the family legacy going, and to Diane, who needed it more right now, had overlooked something. He had signed a document that superseded a trust he did not have the legal authority to dissolve unilaterally, and they did not know that I had already spoken to a lawyer of my own. They did not know any of this when I called my father on a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after that cheerful Tuesday phone call from my mother, and said very calmly, "Dad, I need to talk to you about Grandpa Robert's land. And he said also calmly, sure, son. What about it? And I said, I'd like to understand what happened to my share. And there was a pause. A long pause. And in that pause, I heard 23 years of being invisible, of handshakes instead of hugs, of $300 checkoffs and unreturned calls and dinner tables where I was tolerated rather than celebrated. And I held all of it very quietly inside my chest, and I waited for him to speak. This is where the story really begins. This is where I stopped being the child who absorbed things. This is where I became someone they had not anticipated. The Sunday phone call with my father lasted 11 minutes. I know because I was watching the timer on my phone screen the entire time. The way you watch a clock during something important because your brain needs something concrete to hold on to, while the rest of you is completely unmoored. He was not defensive at first. He was explanatory, which is somehow worse. He had the measured, patient tone of a man who has already rehearsed his answers because he knew, on some level, that this conversation was coming. Not now, not like this, but eventually, in some form. He explained that the land sale had been complicated. He explained that there were taxes involved, carrying costs, maintenance fees, that had accumulated over the years. He explained that the developer's offer had a short window and decisions had to be made quickly. He explained that he and my mother had discussed it and decided. That word, decided, said so matter-of-factly, as if the deciding were the most natural thing in the world, as if there were no trust document, no explicit grandfather's wish, no legal provision that said this decision was not solely his to make. They had decided that Marcus needed capital to grow the business, and that Diane was going through some financial difficulty at the time, and that. And here is where his voice did something interesting, something that I have replayed in my memory many times since. He said that I was doing well, that I was stable, that I had a good job, and Priya worked, and we did not have children yet, and we were fine. I was fine, so my share of the inheritance that my grandfather had explicitly designated for me was quietly redirected to my siblings without my knowledge, without my consent, and without anyone picking up the phone to ask me if I was, in fact, fine with that. Because I was fine. I was doing well. And that was apparently the disqualifying factor. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Success, the thing families are supposed to celebrate, had been used as the justification for taking something from me without asking. I took a breath. I said, Dad, I need you to understand something. I have spoken to a lawyer. Grandpa's will included a trust provision for his grandchildren. That provision was never dissolved. What you did may not be legal. Another pause. Longer this time, and then his voice changed. It got quieter, tighter, the way it used to get when I was a teenager, and had said something that surprised him. He said, You talked to a lawyer. Not a question. A statement. And I said, yes. And he said he needed to go. And he hung up. And I sat in my kitchen with my phone on the table in front of me, and I felt, for the very first time in my adult life, like the room had completely stopped, tilting. What followed was the most surreal 6 weeks of my life. I want to describe it carefully because it unfolded in phases, and each phase taught me something new about the family I thought I had known. The first phase was silence. My father did not call back. My mother did not call. For 9 days, nothing. Priya watched me during those 9 days with a kind of gentle, worried attention, making sure I was eating, asking careful questions at night, not pushing. On the 10th day, Marcus called. Marcus never called me. In the entire previous decade, I could count on one hand the number of times. Marcus had called me unprompted, and every single one of those times it had been because something was wrong and he needed something. So when his name came up on my screen, I already knew this call was not a reunion. He was warm, in the practiced way of someone who has been coached. He said he had talked to Dad. He said he understood I was upset. He said the family did not want this to become a whole thing. I asked him what he thought a whole thing meant. He said he just meant he hoped we could work it out between ourselves without getting lawyers involved. I said, Marcus, I already have a lawyer. The lawyer's involved. Silence. Then he said, You really want to do this to the family? And something in me that had been patient and careful and measured for weeks just went very, very still. I said, Marcus, think about what you just said to me. Think about the framing you just used. You want to do this to the family. Not, Dad took money that was legally mine, and gave it to you without telling me. Not, and we made a mistake and we want to make it right. You want to do this to the family. Do you understand what that framing reveals about how you see this situation? He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, I just don't want things to get ugly. I said, they already are. The ugliness happened when no one called me. And I ended the call. And I cried, not out of hurt. Well, yes, out of hurt, but also out of something stranger. Something almost like relief. Because for the first time I had said the true thing. I had not softened it, had not tucked it away, had not reframed it into something more comfortable for everyone else. I had said the true thing and let it sit there, and the world had not ended. The second phase was my mother. She called on a Thursday evening, and this call was different from Marcus's call. Because my mother, and I say this with complicated love, my mother was far better at the emotional architecture of these conversations than Marcus would ever be. She cried within the first 2 minutes. Not performed crying, or at least not fully performed. My mother's relationship with her own feelings was genuine enough that the tears came from somewhere real, even if the strategy around them was deliberate. She said she was heartbroken that I had taken it this way. She said she and my father had agonized over the decision. She said they had thought about calling me, but they didn't want me to feel pressured or obligated to say no when I was obviously thriving. They didn't want to make me feel guilty for having a good life. She said with a trembling voice that I had heard deployed in many difficult conversations over the years, that they had done it out of love. Out of love for Marcus and Diane, who needed it. And out of love for me, knowing I would understand. Because I always understood. Because I was the strong one. Because she and my father had always known they could count on me. And I sat on the other end of that phone call and I listened to my strength, my stability, my understanding being used against me one more time. And I thought, about 12 years old and a wooden chair and the word equal, and I said, Mom, I love you. I want you to know that before I say this next thing. But what you just told me, that you didn't tell me because you knew I'd be fine, and that you needed me to be strong enough to absorb this, that is not love. Love does not make decisions for other people by deciding in advance how they'll feel. Love asks. Love calls. Love says, we're thinking about this. What do you think? What you did was use my stability as a reason to exclude me. And I need you to understand that I see that now. I see it clearly, and I have seen it for a long time. She went quiet. Not the quiet of someone who has nothing to say. The quiet of someone who has been seen in a way they were not prepared for. Then, very softly, she said, I don't know what you want from us. And I said, what Grandpa Robert wanted. My share. That's what I want. She said she needed to talk to my father. I said I understood. I said my lawyer would be sending a letter the following week. She cried harder. I said goodnight. I sat in the bathroom for a while afterward and let myself feel everything I had been holding, the grief of it, the exhaustion of it, the strange, terrible clarity of finally having said, out loud, in plain words, what I had always known but never named. Then I washed my face and went back to Priya, and she held my hand, and she did not say I told you so, because she is not that kind of person. And I thought, I built one good thing. Whatever they took, I built one true good thing in my life. The lawyer's letter went out on a Monday. By Wednesday, my father had retained his own attorney. By Thursday, Aunt Carol had called me of her own accord and told me she was aware the land had been sold, and she had not been properly consulted either. Her portion, apparently, had also been handled in a way she found irregular. And she asked carefully whether she might speak to my lawyer. I said yes. By the following Monday, what had been a quiet family disagreement had become a formal legal matter with two plaintiffs, a clear paper trail, a trust provision that had never been properly dissolved, and a sale that had been executed in a way my lawyer described as, at minimum, procedurally improper. I want to be honest with you here. The legal process was not cinematic. It was not a courtroom drama with a dramatic moment where someone broke down under cross-examination. It was slow and expensive and emotionally grinding in a way that nobody tells you about when they tell you to stand up for yourself. There were months of document exchange. There were depositions where I sat across a table from a lawyer hired by my father and answered questions about my financial status, my knowledge of family, estate matters, My relationship with my grandfather in a flat, careful voice, while my heart hammered behind my ribs. There were nights when Priya would find me at the kitchen table at midnight with documents spread out in front of me, and she would make tea and sit with me, without talking, which is its own kind of love language, and I was grateful for it in ways I could not articulate. My relationship with my parents during those months was essentially frozen, civil, minimal, surface level. Holiday gatherings were excruciating exercises in performance. Everyone pretending that the thing happening was not happening, everyone talking about weather and sports and Diane's new apartment, while an enormous unspoken legal reality sat at the center of the dinner table like a guest nobody would acknowledge. Marcus avoided my eyes. Diane, who I had thought might be the one family member to express some discomfort with the situation, had apparently decided that loyalty meant staying completely silent, which I noted and filed away. 11 months after I sent that lawyer's letter, we reached a settlement. I am not going to tell you the exact number, both because I signed agreements that constrain what I can say, and because the number itself is not the point. The point is that my grandfather's explicit wish, that word equal, was honored. My portion of the proceeds from that land sale was returned to me, with interest, through a structured legal agreement that my father signed on a Tuesday afternoon that I know was excruciating for him in ways that had nothing to do with money. My Aunt Carol received her own resolution separately. The developer's deal had gone through, the land was already gone, transformed into something my grandfather would not have recognized. But the money that was supposed to be mine came back to where it was always supposed to be. And here's the thing I want you to understand about what happened after. Because this is the part that surprises people when I tell this story. I thought I would feel triumphant. I thought I would feel vindicated in this clear, uncomplicated way, like the end of a film where the music swells and, definitively who was right. I did not feel that. What I felt was something much quieter and much sadder and eventually much more useful. I felt grief. Pure, clean grief for the family I had always hoped we were, but had finally, fully, irreversibly understood we were not. I grieved the version of my father who I had needed him to be and who he had never managed to become. I grieved the dinners where I had eaten quietly and told myself the dynamic was normal. I grieved the graduations and the phone calls and the handshakes instead of hugs. I grieved the inheritance not for the money but for what it represented. My grandfather's deliberate, explicit desire that I be counted, that I be seen, that I be equal. And I grieved the fact that my own parents had looked at that wish and decided I did not need it because I was doing well. I let myself grieve all of it. And then I did something that surprised even Priya. I called my father, not my lawyer, not through a third party, not with a prepared statement. I called him directly on a regular afternoon, and when he answered, I said, "Dad, I don't want to be your enemy. I have never wanted to be your enemy. But I need you to hear something from me directly, without a lawyer in the room." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Okay." And I said, "I know you think you were protecting me by leaving me out of this. I know that in your mind, the story you told yourself was that Marcus needed it, and Diane needed it, and I was the one who didn't need anything. I know you have probably told yourself that version of events so many times it feels true to you now. But Dad, the reason I didn't need anything is because I built my own life. I built it without your help. Not because I didn't want it, because it was never really offered. And for a long time I told myself that was okay, that families are complicated, that I was strong enough to handle being the one who didn't need things. But what you did with Grandpa's land was not about what I needed. It was about whether I was worth counting. And you decided I wasn't. I need you to know that I know that. Not because I want you to feel terrible, but because I have spent my entire adult life being the child in your family who was fine, and I am done being fine in a way that requires me to pretend I don't see what is happening. There was a long silence after that, a very long silence. And then my father said something I had never heard him say to me. Not once in my entire life. He said, "I think I handled things wrong." Not "I'm sorry." Not "I was wrong." "I think I handled things wrong." From my father, from that particular man, in that particular voice. That sentence was a cathedral. It was the closest thing to accountability I had ever heard from him, and I knew It was probably the closest I was ever going to get, and I made a decision in that moment to accept it. Not because it was enough, it was not enough, but because holding out for more was going to cost me things I could no longer afford to spend, and because somewhere in my grandfather's will, in his insistence on the word equal, I heard not just a legal instruction, but a kind of love. The love of a man who had watched his family carefully and wanted to make sure that the quiet ones, the ones who seemed fine, were counted too. And I decided to honor that by counting myself, by no longer waiting for my family to see me before I agreed to be visible. Here is where I am now, and I want to tell you this part too because the internet is full of revenge stories that end at the moment of victory and never show you what comes after victory, never show you that winning something you should have always had does not automatically heal the years of not having it. Priya and I are good. We are genuinely, quietly, deeply good in the way that people are good when they have been through something hard together and come out still choosing each other. We used some of that settlement money to put a down payment on a house. Not a dramatic house, just a house, our house, with a backyard I already have plans for and a kitchen where the coffee maker is exactly where I want it. I see my parents occasionally. Holidays, sometimes a dinner. The relationship is different now, smaller in some ways, but more honest in a way I have come to value more than the large, dishonest version we had before. My father and I have conversations that are still not easy and probably never will be, but they are real in a way they never used to be because I stopped performing comfort to make him feel like everything was fine and started just talking to him like a human being whose story I know and who knows mine. My mother and I have a more complicated road. She is a woman who loves through action rather than accountability, and accountability is the thing I most needed from her, and she does not easily give it. But she calls more. She asks more real questions. She is trying in the way people try when something has cracked open, something real. And I am choosing to see the trying even when it is imperfect. Marcus and I are distant, politely, permanently distant. Some bridges do not burn, they just quietly close. Diane reached out 6 months after the settlement and said something to me that I will keep privately, that she said in a parking lot after a family dinner, crying a little in the way she does, and I held on to it and forgave her in my own time, in my own way. Because forgiveness, I have learned, is not the same as forgetting, and it is not the same as pretending. It is a decision you make about what you want to carry forward and what you want to put down, and I am still making that decision daily, and some days it is easier than others. But here's the thing I want you to leave with. Here is the thing I need you to hear if you have been sitting with me through this entire story, if you recognize yourself in any part of it, the middle child, the fine one, the strong one, the one who was left out of decisions, because everyone assumed you would absorb it. The thing about being the one who does not need anything is that it is a role that will be assigned to you whether you want it or not, and the only way out of it is to refuse the assignment. Not loudly, not angrily, not by burning the family down, but clearly. By saying, I am here. I count, not because I need you to see me, but because I know that I am worth being seen. My grandfather knew it. He wrote it into a legal document with his own hand so that even after he was gone, even in a wooden chair in a scratchy blazer at 12 years old, someone would have to say the word equal out loud in an official room and mean it. He gave me that. The rest, the decades of dinner tables, the handshakes, the redirected money, the cheerful Tuesday phone calls, the rest I had to fight for myself. And I did. I am not the same person I was before I made that first call to my aunt, before I pulled out that will, before I sat at my kitchen table at midnight with documents spread out in front of me while Priya made tea in the dark. I am harder in some places and softer in others. I know more clearly than I ever have what I will accept and what I will not, and I know that the courage it takes to say that out loud to the people who are supposed to love you most is not a small courage. It is the kind that costs something. It is the kind that changes you. And I am glad, despite everything, despite all of it, I am genuinely glad that I found it. Because the alternative was spending the rest of my life being fine in a way that was slowly making me disappear. And I am done disappearing. Whatever you are carrying right now, whatever quiet unfairness you have been absorbing and telling yourself is just how families work, whatever inheritance. literal or emotional. You have been standing just outside the circle of, I need you to hear this. You are worth counting. You always were. Don't wait for someone else to write it into a document before you believe it.